we're also, as I told you before, we're really excited to have Kyera with us from the Royal Slave House in Medford. I don't know, a show of hands of anyone here who knows of the Royal Slave House? Okay. I'm going to give you this mic. So I would love to I loved your short narrative. And I think one of the things that we talk a lot about, and we've been talking a lot about in this festival, is lifting up these voices, right? We're looking at people and places and in situations where we don't know anything about it, right? We live such a layered history, all of us do. And so not knowing all the things that Harriet Tubman did, and then this history which you all, unearthed in your story. So then I just ask you, why this film, and what was it that you really felt like this story needed to be told?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I live right next to New Bedford in Fairhaven, and I had always heard about Frederick Douglass and his incredible story, but I had never heard about the woman who had helped, help him in his new life, Polly Johnson. And so I had learned about Polly Johnson's story on the New Bedford Historical Society's website, and I was so taken aback by all of her accomplishments and how much of a trailblazer that she was, owning her own business in the city, owning property in her name, becoming one of the most wealthy women of color in the city by the time of her death. And I just really wanted to learn more about her. And that's where me and Jan met, and yeah, do you want to talk more about that too? We worked so closely together to write the script, and Jan was really instrumental in the whole process of making Sweet Freedom.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. Nice being here with you. I'll say one thing because I have a lot of different lives. So I used to work for the Massachusetts Historical Commission, and one of the projects that took place while I was working there was Hibernian Hall. So I'm really happy to be in it and see it completed and see it, contribute to the neighborhood, and it's a beautiful building. But I'm an architectural historian by trade, but also a historian of American history. And for me, I've known about Polly Johnson since like 1999. I had an office in the Nathan and Polly Johnson House. I also consulted with the Historical Society. Alyssa contacted me because at the Historical Society they said, you need to contact me. And so that's how I got involved in this. And wow, I kind of like to answer questions more than just talk. So it was a great process, I will say that. I love seeing how it's depicted on the screen. Alyssa was a great person to partner with because everything I threw at her, she actually incorporated into the script because I changed characters, I changed language. We didn't talk about costuming, but we could have talked about that. But we talked about those things, and it's nice when you see someone take your advice and incorporate it to make something stronger. So I appreciate that.
Kyera, why is it so important for these stories and the work that you do at the Royal Slave House? It's one of the things that we talk about here, like I said before, and really unearthing these and making sure that we're bringing them to the top of the ladder so that people can have that opportunity. Why is it?
Yeah, I think what your film did so well and what the piece on Harriet Tubman is actually to make central the accomplishments of Black women in these movements. I think oftentimes when we're thinking about the history of slavery and we're thinking about resistance and we're thinking about rebellion, we often center Black men, which is important, but there are also a lot of Black women whose names we don't often know, who are doing a lot of work. And then when it comes to someone like Harriet Tubman, we know her very well, but we know her through a very specific lens. And so when we broaden that story, we get to see more that's happening on the landscape. And we get to see kind of the risks that they're taking and how they're doing that not only to protect themselves, but their entire community. And I think we see that at the Royal House of Slave Quarters through the story of Belinda Sutton, who sues her former enslaver for a pension in the state of Massachusetts and becomes the first Black woman in the North who has a successful reparations petition.
So you all decided that you would create this film as a narrative and not as a documentary. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I come from a filmmaker background. I graduated from the University of Rhode Island in film and business management. And documentary is such a powerful tool for really education. And I come from a very storyteller background where I like to see the characters really come alive and see actors portray and in that form of art. So, and I don't know if you have anything to say about that too, yeah.
I guess one of the things I was thinking about when I was watching the movie was how the audience was taking it. And just so you know, most of the things that are in here are historical fact. There was a Gibson family, they did stay with the Johnsons. Nathan actually did leave and never came home. He left all the property in her name, so there's a lot of historical facts in it. But it would be hard to make it a documentary because one of the things about African American history is we don't have a lot of documentation. And that's the hardest part about telling our stories. We have to paint with a very broad brush and incorporate truth and some narrative to make the story live and understandable to people.
And I was gonna say, one of the things that you all do so well in telling the history of Polly Johnson is really centering it in New Bedford. And I think one of the things that's so important about how we tell our stories is to think about place, to think about where people are, to think about how it enables them to usher people through freedom. You know, New Bedford is a major port city. Slavery had already been outlawed, but it allows us to think about how, you know, even though Massachusetts doesn't have slavery at a certain time, it's still very complicit. And people from the South are coming north and trying to snatch black people back into slavery, and then Black people are literally resisting even though they themselves have freedom. And so I think it's a really, really important way to do that work.
Yeah, I think just being able to tell her story, and there are so many of these stories in Massachusetts, but obviously throughout the country that never get told. So that's my question too, is like, how do you find these stories? And then how do we, as just general audience, you know, bring them forward? Because I didn't know the story of Polly, and you know, it's really important to know. So, I mean, how do we go about making sure that we unearth these stories?
Oh, it's a good question. It's a great question. It's my favorite question to answer. But you want to start first, or do you want me to go?
That's a great question. I'm not sure how to answer it. I think some of the things, well, the first thing that hit my mind was we're all storytellers and we all have people in our family that we can tell stories about. And you find out about people that way. And then also, like, the hard way is doing the research in the newspapers, in the directories, in the stories, in the churches. You know, some of the churches in New Bedford, we have a church that's like 120 years old. So there's people who are affiliated with that church, there are church records. You can go and see who was there, who went to the church, who didn't go to the church, or it depends on the community you're in too. Like, I know Boston has a tremendous African American history, and it moved from the North Slope of Beacon Hill to here. So trying to figure out how to go backwards and see all those connections. I'm a big person who believes everybody's networked. And so you just have to find those networks.
That was a great response. I don't have much to add to that other than a part of, I think, doing the work is being curious. And I think oftentimes when it comes to the history of Black people, especially in certain periods, 18th and 19th century, and talking about slavery, we're told that we're not going to find much. that, oh, there's only going to be a few records and that's it. But actually, when you go and you start to look, you start to see that there's always more than what you anticipate. And I think sometimes being creative about how we tell that story. Whether you find one document or you find 20, and 20 would be a lot, but whether you find one document or 20, that you still find it important enough to tell these histories. And I think also following up on things that you've heard passed down from your family. Oftentimes people wait for historians to validate history, but honestly, I've learned the most from community members telling me about something in an archive or something happening on a street, and then I go find out that it actually happened. So I think making sure that we honor that everyone is a storyteller and that everyone's history is also valid.
And I would just add too, when you said being curious, that's the first word that came to my mind too, just being curious and feeling inspired by people's stories. Polly Johnson, of course, and listening. I'm a big believer in just being a good listener can teach you so much. And Janet sent me in other directions. Lee Blake, the president of the New Bedford Historical Society, sent me in so many directions, learning about the vigilance committees, book talks, and going to this library and to this place, learning from the Picasso Wampanoag tribe, working closely with Chief Gray Fox Page and learning about their story. And there's just so much to learn. And then now having completed Sweet Freedom and showing it in different libraries and community screenings, schools, colleges, I've heard even more stories of people who are so inspired and they want to tell me about, growing up in their family all over the country and just all the insane amount of stories and just being a good listener and being curious and like you said, everyone's a storyteller, definitely.
I'd love to now open it up to any questions from the audience for the filmmaker about the film, for Kyera about the Royal Slave House. Anybody have a question?
I have several questions actually. My first would be, did you have a specific audience in mind when you made Sweet Freedom because of the style of the film? I'm just going to ask all my questions and then you can choose how to answer them. She was both Wampanoag and Black. Can you talk about the intersectionality of that, the two cultures? And I guess there was a third question. We'll just go with those two.
Yeah, for the audience, I think just people who are curious and interested in history, of course. I think so much of I just go right into her story and Polly Johnson's story and the story of New Bedford. It's been really exciting for the city itself. It was supported first with New Bedford Creative with a grant, and so we knew that this was going to be a very powerful story for New Bedford and the general South Coast area, just New England in general too. Would you like to talk about this?
So about the indigenous African American story, one thing, I can give you the academic answer, which is, during the early part of Massachusetts, there were lots of Black men, but not so many Black women. So that's when you start seeing the intersectionality of the two groups coming together, especially in that area where she lived, the Tiverton area, the Freetown area, the Lakeville area. You also see it in Aquinnah. You also see it on Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket. People were adopted into the tribe. Or they weren't adopted, I take that back. They weren't adopted into the tribe. They might have married an indigenous woman. If you know anything about James Earl's census in 1859 of indigenous communities, everyone who's not indigenous in that census is identified as a foreigner, no matter what their race is. So they're not adopted into the tribe, but they do live with the tribe. So that's where you get that intersectionality from. And in terms of where polys came from, I don't think we know that answer. We don't even know what poly looked like. So there's a picture of her granddaughter, like a portrait picture of her granddaughter, but there's nothing to really identify her.
And to circle back on what I was thinking before, too, a history teacher who does make an appearance in the film as a frying pan vigilante. As you so eloquently put, it's a very localized story that has those nationwide themes. And I think that's the exciting part, too, about telling a very specific story that appeals to those broader themes of freedom and how our country, you know, those ideals of freedom, and people like Polly Johnson who went under the radar, who were doing the work. So really, it's a United States story appealing to everybody in our country, really.
And I will say that sentence that Nathan says about no slave has ever been taken from New Bedford, I mean, we know that people have said it. It may not have been him, but that was said about New Bedford.
Good question back there.
Hi. Like you said earlier, in our history there's a lot of gaps, and so I was just wondering, in the story, if you came across gaps, what creative liberties you took to fill in those gaps, and what challenges you might have overcame in filling in them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what comes to mind, one of the larger pieces that is one of the more creative liberties is the slave catchers wanting to depict that evil in a way. And those two are fictionalized. And the scene where they come into the shop and there's the fight and all of that, that is fictional, that did not happen. But it is inspired by something that really did happen in New Bedford, where you had a man coming up to New Bedford to get information about runaway slaves, go back, bring them back down to the South. And was it Nathan Johnson? Yeah. Yeah, there was a vigilance committee in the city that made sure that didn't happen, cornering him in a church, beating him up and sending him on his way, never to come back. So that's the kind of, you know, with the creative liberty, wanting to be inspired by the real history and then making it work for the narrative, for the story that we're telling.
And one thing I will say is, Alyssa has actually managed to keep the timeline very narrow. Like, you don't realize this is only over like a year. It feels a lot longer, but it's like 1839, and it's like a year after Frederick Douglass came up. It is the year that William Roach Jr. became 80 years old. They did have a vigilance committee in New Bedford. So all of those things are true, and all of those, that timeline is accurate. And the Gibsons did come up to New Bedford like 1834, 1835. So all of that is accuracy. There's not a lot of gaps there.
Something specific too, I love this going back and forth, it's like a great conversation. Something specific too, if you remember, we had talked about Betsy Gibson and why would she want to go back? Why would that even be an idea that she would think about? You know, it's just like, why would she even trying to get inside of her mind? And we had talked about, well, her family. You know, you've got her family back home, and so those things, figuring out the character motivations too, took a little bit of brainstorming and talking it through, and just trying to get inside the minds of these real life people, because it wasn't written down. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the important parts, like you were saying before, that we're missing a lot of this history. And a lot of these films and documentaries and everything that you're going to see will do that, will add in this sort of information. And so, do we have any more questions from the audience? Or do someone else?
Thank you. This is wonderful. I have a question about the art of storytelling. When you're dealing in Sweet Freedom with such traumatic, frightening material, it was a truly frightening experience watching the film. I'm curious about your thinking about how to make it sufficiently vivid to be true to the history of the horrors of that time, while at the same time making it accessible and watchable. And yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, that's a great question, of course. and being African American myself too, I think it's a very careful line to tread, and I really rely on the people around me, on Jen, on Lee, on my actors too, who are living that experience. The actor who plays Nathan Johnson, Polly's husband, Jomo Peters, he had said that when he first got to set the very first day, our first day of shooting, it was the slave catcher scene on the horses. And as soon as they came around the bend, and he's getting ready, he's getting his costume on, he saw him come around the bend in his full costume, and he just had a shiver that went up his spine. Like this just visceral reaction. And that was so powerful to me, because I just wow, And I think it's just a lot of talking with the other artists that you're working with. It's a very collaborative process. And thinking about, too, that end goal of wanting this to be accessible for students. And you can't go too graphic because, you want to show it in the schools, and that's the ultimate purpose, is for education as well.
Yeah, I'm gonna be the oddball here. So my question would be to the audience, why can everyone accept the violence of the movies we see in the movie theaters, but can't accept the truth and the violence that's in the truth and in our true history? Because this is what happened to Black people. We know it happened to them, but everybody's okay with, I'm trying to think of a really violent movie. Did anybody see Quentin Tarantino, the movie Civil War that just came out? That was pretty violent. Nobody asked those kind of questions, so I'm glad you asked that question, so I kind of go on my little soapbox. Nobody asked those questions, like how can we put up with all this violence on TV and in the movie theaters, but when we have something that's based in history, we have a hard time with it. I think it's because in this country, we don't want to face our history. And until we can do that, we can't change.
And I'll just add, I feel the same exact way. And I just like to always remind people that we are actually in a place of privilege because that did not happen to us, Many of us, they're our ancestors, but we are not living through that. And so while I understand how it is frightening or hard to watch, one of the things we have to do is kind of step outside of that to really grapple with the fact that, one of the actors talks about seeing that and automatically, getting scared. And I think that tells us a lot about history and a lot about violence, and also a lot about how Black people move through society today. The cops could evoke that same feeling. And so it's always a reminder that while the past is the past, it is also very present. And it should be a way, and I think, the film is a way for us to not only understand the past, but also understand how Black people have to navigate the realities of systemic oppression and violence today.
Wow. This has been a reckoning in a way that, and there's so much talent in the fact that our history is very traumatizing. And I think that's why many of us shy away from films and documentaries. We know it's true, it happened, there's no denying. But because of the trauma that we still experience in society today, it's hard to digest. I refuse to watch Roots. I refuse to watch any history when our children are about to return to school in September. It's volatile. It creates a lot of trauma for the children even. To be able to see outside of, this really did happen to us, but we don't talk about the aftermath of the trauma that we're still dealing with. And you said it very well. You put it very well. We're still in that moment that it could happen all over again. And it's not something that we want to talk about, or we kind of we're still trying to get past the history, and now the history is being removed from the schools, the institutions. But it's still our history. It's painful, yes. It's rich. Everybody wants to study it because it's important that we continue to tell a story. Our generations need to hear the ancestral stories. How we got over. It took a lot. Oh, I could go on. Let me stop.
Thank you. And I think it's true, I mean, it is hard to have to watch that, but we have to. Because history repeats itself, and history is repeating itself. And if we're not constantly in conversation about it, and at ROXFILM we talk a lot about using film as a catalyst for conversation. And I think that that's what we do to bring these films so that we can have these conversations, so that we don't forget, and that we do remember that we have to tell our stories, and we have to have conversations with people. Not just your kids, other kids, whomever is going to listen, and film helps us do that. All right, one more question.
Ladies, I enjoyed it tremendously, very interesting, very informative. One of the questions I have that was mentioned in the Harriet Tubman movie was, I don't know whether to say a dialect or a language called Gala. Is that what it was? Is that still used today? Is it still this?
Well, I'm actually a descendant of Gullah and Geechees because I have a grandparent from Savannah, a grandparent from Charleston, and a grandparent from Athens, Georgia. So, yeah, I'm pretty sure. I'm there. But yes, Gullah is still a language, and actually, I think a few years ago, there was a gentleman teaching it at Harvard University. Because there is a Bible, there are people who are still learning it and using it. And I grew up in New York City, so I wasn't in the South. I do remember some cousins coming to visit us from Charleston, South Carolina, and I thought they were West Indian, because that's kind of how it sounds. It sounds like you're West Indian and not from the South. But it's still alive, they still have lots of festivals. I kind of want to, are you a Gullah person? There you go. See, I don't know what he said. You can understand it if you listen long enough, but yeah.
Thank you very much. It was a lot of hard work. I appreciate it.
And I just wanted to pick back up on one of the things that was said, which was, I think so much about how our history is taught is through a place of shame. I think people feel a lot of shame around the history of slavery, but that's actually a tool of white supremacy, because if actually slavery is taught more comprehensively, we would reframe it just a little bit, where it is extremely violent, it is a very brutal institution, and that when white people were enslaving black people, they were doing so intentionally. I think we have this weird notion that floats around that slavery was some unpaid internship where black people learned all these skills. And that's not true. White people were going to places to enslave black people for their knowledge, for their skills. And so even in the films when we're talking about South Carolina and talking about rice fields, if you go and you look at slave schedules, you'll see engineer next to black people's names. White people did not know how to do that planting. They had no idea. And so when we start to reframe that history, and what I hope that happens at the museum and through films like the one that you all put together, is that specifically with students, that they can also have a pride in their history and understand that while slavery is brutal, we also brought so much knowledge here and so much culture, and that both can coexist. And the fact of the matter is that black people's labor was stolen, and I think we really have to talk more about that. And I think it will change how people interact with that history. And not having DeSantis say well, people gain skills. It's like, absolutely not. They already had the knowledge. They already had the skills.
I just want to quickly mention that one Gullah is supposed to be like a mixed up version of Angola, which is where the people came from who did the rice planting. So they did bring those skills with them across the Atlantic Ocean.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for your film, for your knowledge and expertise. I want everyone to visit the museum. And so we're honored to have you here, so thank you very much. And thank all of you for coming out to the senior lunch for these screenings. And we have another 3 days. We have another film right after this that's going to be screening. And then we are tomorrow at Mass College of Art for the next 2 days. And then we close at the Museum of Fine Art. So there's probably another 30 films for you to see in the Roxbury International Film Festival. So that we hope that you will join us. And I think we have one more.
I forgot, where is the museum in Medford?
Oh, the museum in Medford.
It is 15 George Street, Medford. It is about a 10-minute walk from Tufts University. And if you want to look us up, it is Royall with 2 L's, house.org. And we're open the weekends, and we'll be actually doing a reading of Frederick Douglass on July 4th. And on that day, the museum is open and free for anyone who visits.
So the reading that you're doing is going to be at the museum now?
Yep, it's going to be at the museum. Yeah.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much.